right, strap yourselves in for a wild one today because we are diving headfirst into a book that really shook things up in the world of political philosophy, Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick.
Oh, yeah, Nozick.
Now, I know, the title alone might make you think, whoa, heavy stuff.
A bit intense.
Yeah, but trust me on this one.
You definitely should.
It's a fascinating read, absolutely packed with ideas that are still crazy relevant today, even decades after it was first published.
What I find most fascinating about Nozick is that he doesn't just critique existing political systems. Like, he doesn't just go after, socialism or capitalism.
Yeah.
He goes deeper than that. He challenges the entire foundation of how we think about the role of government in the first place.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. Nozick starts with this concept of anarchy, which always grabs my attention.
It's a powerful word.
It is. It kind of makes you think of, like, total chaos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for a lot of people, yeah.
But he's really using it as a starting point to ask this really, really big question. Can we even justify having a state at all if we truly value individual freedom?
And this is where Nozick's genius really comes through. He uses this thought experiment, and it's where everyone exists in a state of nature, right?
Okay.
No government, no rules, just individuals on their own trying to figure things out.
Right. So this isn't about, like, whether humans actually lived in a state of nature at some point in history.
No, not at all.
It's more about understanding why humans would ever choose to move away from that total individual freedom to a system where there are rules, where there's some kind of governing body.
Exactly. And Nozick says even in this state of nature, this chaotic state of nature, people wouldn't just exist in complete isolation. They'd naturally form groups for protection, to safeguard themselves, their property, their lives.
Right, because even without formal laws, it just makes sense. There's this basic human desire for security, for some kind of order.
Absolutely. There's strength in numbers. So even without a planned government, people would instinctively find ways to band together for safety, for mutual protection.
Okay, so then we start to see some kind of natural hierarchy emerging. Even without anyone setting out intentionally to create a government, these groups kind of like evolve to fill that need.
That's the core of Nozick's invisible hand argument. He borrows that phrase, of course, from the economist Adam Smith.
Right.
And it suggests that just like in those free markets, where order supposedly arises from individual economic choices, even in the realm of security, of governance, some level of order, some kind of structure can emerge without a central planner, without somebody in charge saying this is how it's going to be.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially if you're used to thinking about government as this thing that's always been there, this thing that was intentionally designed.
Right.
But then even this minimal state, this dominant protective agency, wouldn't it still, by its very nature, have to infringe on individual liberties to some extent?
Right. That is the question.
Yeah.
That's the heart of it. And Nozick, he doesn't shy away from that at all. He acknowledges that any state, even one that kind of emerges in this organic way, it's still going to have power.
Right.
And with power
Comes the potential for abuse.
Exactly, exactly.
So how do you square that with this whole emphasis on individual liberty being so important? It seems like he's trying to, like, walk this really fine line.
Yeah, he is. And that's where his whole concept of legitimate state power comes into play. So Nozick says that a state's power, it's only really justified when it's being used to protect individual rights.
Okay.
Things like the right to life, liberty, property,
Right, the basics.
the fundamentals. But it can't then turn around and use that power to infringe on those very same rights that it's supposed to be protecting.
So it's almost like drawing a line in the sand. Like, the state can do certain things to, like, keep people safe, to prevent harm, but it can't cross that line and start dictating how people should live their lives, what they can do with their own stuff, their own property.
Exactly. And, for Nozick, this is where things get really, really controversial.
Yeah.
Because he argues that a lot of the things that we typically associate with government, things like social programs, wealth redistribution, these kinds of things, for Nozick, these actually step over that line.
Okay.
Because he sees them as violations of what he calls entitlement theory, this idea that you have a right to anything that you acquire justly.
Entitlement theory. Break that down for me a little bit.
Yeah. So basically, it's this idea that if you earn something through your hard work, or you trade for it fairly, or even if somebody just decides, hey, I'm going to give you this as a gift, you came by it through just means. Nozick would argue that the state has no business coming in and taking that from you, taking those holdings from you to give to someone else, even in the name of, trying to create a more equal society or social justice, those kinds of things.
Yeah, because I can see how that gets to the heart of a lot of debates we have today, right? About what the role of government should be.
Absolutely.
On the one hand, it seems fundamentally unfair for some people to have so much, to be so wealthy, while others are really struggling to just, like, get by. But then, on the other hand, if you start taking away what people have earned, even if it's in the name of equality, aren't you also kind of undermining their individual freedom in that process?
That's exactly the tension that Nozick wants us to sit with. And to be clear, he wasn't saying that we should just ignore people who are less fortunate.
Yeah.
He still very much believed in charity. He believed in voluntary assistance. His issue was specifically with the state being the one to mandate that redistribution of wealth. And to illustrate this point, he has this very famous argument. It's called the Wilt Chamberlain argument.
Oh, yeah, the basketball player. I've heard of this one.
Exactly.
I could use a little refresher on how it works, though.
Okay, so picture this. Imagine a society where everything is perfectly equal. Everyone has the exact same amount of wealth. Nobody has more, nobody has less.
Okay.
But then you've got Wilt Chamberlain, legendary basketball player, amazing athlete, and he signs a contract where he gets, say, an extra $1 from every ticket that's sold to one of his games. People love Wilt Chamberlain, so they flock to see him play. And over time, he ends up becoming incredibly wealthy,
Right?
Because he's got this extra $1 coming in from every ticket. Everyone else is staying the same, but he's just gradually accumulating more and more wealth. So the question Nozick asks is that unjust?
Well, it doesn't feel inherently wrong because, I mean, everyone who went to those games, they chose to pay that extra $1. They were presumably happy to do it because they got to see, this incredible athlete. But then you do end up with this massive wealth gap that exists solely because of people's voluntary choices.
Precisely. And that is Nozick's point.
Okay.
He would argue that if you try to then correct for this new distribution of wealth, which came about through entirely voluntary transactions, you'd essentially be stuck in this constant loop of interference, right? People would be free to make choices, but then the government would have to constantly step in and adjust things to try to maintain that initial pattern of equality that you started with.
So you're saying that by even trying to enforce a specific outcome, a specific distribution of wealth, you inevitably end up limiting individual freedom in the process. It's like a game of whack-a-mole, right? Like as soon as you try to level things out in one place, new inequalities pop up because of the choices that people are making.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And for Nozick, that kind of constant intervention that goes against this core principle of individual self-ownership. We own ourselves, we own our labor, we own the fruits of our labor. And so to take that away, even for what seem like noble causes, like trying to achieve greater equality or social justice, ultimately for Nozick, that is a form of coercion. It's treating individuals as a means to an end rather than as ends in themselves.
Okay, so if Nozick is so against big government stepping in and redistributing wealth, what's the alternative? What does he actually propose?
Well, this is where I think things get really interesting and maybe even a bit surprising, because Nozick wasn't setting out to design one perfect utopia that everyone would be forced to live in. Instead, he talks about what he calls a framework for utopia.
Framework for utopia. Okay, now you've got to explain this one. What does that even mean?
So think of it like a meta-utopia.
Okay.
It's almost like an umbrella term for a society where you could have lots of different utopias all existing at the same time.
Oh, interesting. So instead of one size fits all, it's more like choose your own adventure, choose your own utopia.
Yeah, exactly. He recognized that people have totally different ideas about what a good life actually looks like. Some people would thrive in a socialist kind of commune. Others would much prefer a completely free market kind of paradise.
Right.
Others, maybe a deeply religious community. Who's to say which one of those is the right answer?
So instead of saying this is the perfect society and we're all going to live this way, it's more like here's a bunch of options, figure out what works best for you.
Exactly. And the real key, he argued, was freedom of choice. People should be able to voluntarily join the community that best fits their own values, their own goals, even their quirks, right?
Right.
And if it's not working out, they should be free to leave and go try to find a better fit for them somewhere else. No one is stuck in a system that just doesn't work for them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
But I have to ask, wouldn't this just be completely chaotic in practice? How do you prevent all these different little mini utopias from clashing with each other?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Or even worse, right? Like going full Lord of the Flies on each other.
Well, and that's where, in Nozick's view, that minimal state still has a role to play, but it's a very, very limited role.
Okay.
So in his framework, the state would act as a kind of referee, protecting basic rights, making sure that contracts are enforced, and most importantly, preventing any one group from imposing its will on all the others.
Interesting. So it's about ensuring a level playing field.
Exactly, where all these very diverse communities could potentially coexist peacefully.
Okay, I get it. It is a fascinating idea, but part of me still wonders if it's just a bit too idealistic.
Sure.
Like, can you really expect people to just peacefully coexist when they have such fundamentally different values, different ways of life?
No, I mean, those are definitely valid questions, and Nozick acknowledged that. He knew there were challenges inherent in his framework. He wasn't naive about human nature. But I think he remained optimistic that a system based on this kind of voluntary cooperation, individual liberty, and a real deep respect for individual rights could create a society that's more just, more fulfilling, than one that's based on coercion or some single imposed idea of the good.
Right. It's about letting people choose their own path.
Exactly.
So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into anarchy, state, and utopia, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What do we really want people to remember about Nozick, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything he said?
I think one of Nozick's greatest contributions was just forcing us to ask those big, hard questions about this balance between individual liberty on the one hand and the role of the state on the other.
It's something we all grapple with, to some extent.
Absolutely. He makes us think critically about, like, how much power are we really willing to hand over to authorities, even if they have the best intentions? And what are the potential consequences, good and bad, of all of our political choices?
He reminds us there are always different perspectives to consider. There are always trade-offs.
Always. And there are very rarely easy answers when it comes to actually trying to build a just and fulfilling society.
Right. So to everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. What would your ideal society actually look like? How would you balance individual freedom with the common good? How can we learn from Nozick's thought experiment, even if we don't agree with all of his conclusions, to create a world that respects individual rights while still striving for something more just, more equitable for everyone? Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep diving deep.